Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the first keynote speech of the Disability and Rights Conference. My name is Luke Beasley. I am a steering group member of the Marxism and Disability Network, and I will be chairing the Q&A following this discussion. As a visually impaired person, I am not very good at giving visual descriptions of myself, so we must rest satisfied with my saying that I am a white fella in his mid-30s with a beard, a haircut I deeply regret, and I am wearing a grey t-shirt on the outside because grey is how I feel on the inside. As with other sessions today, live captioning and live BSL interpretation will be available to all participants. If you require one of these adaptations, then please look for either the Show CC or Interpreter button in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. If you cannot see these, then click on the button that says More with 3 little dots next to it, and you should be able to access them through there. As with before, we ask everyone to keep their mics and cameras off during the presentation and the Q&A, and we ask for all questions to Ravi to be please put through the Q&A function, again available either in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen or through the More button. This is very important. If you were to use the chat to put questions or comments, it would interrupt screen reader users' ability to engage with the talk. So again, please be collegiate, please be comradely, and use the Q&A function so everyone can hear Professor Malhotra clearly throughout the presentation. If you have any tech difficulties at all as we are going on, then my colleague Nell in the chat will be very happy to help you in any way that she can. Again, please direct message her. So if you click on the little blue button in the top left corner of the chat bar, it will give you an option of direct messaging people in the room. Just look for Nell and you will find her there. Again, before we start, huge thanks to our BSL interpreters, huge thanks to our tech supports, and also huge thanks to Professor Malhotra for joining us today. It strikes me that many of our participants are coming to this conference from different backgrounds, and I believe that Ravi has deeply influenced us, whichever one we come from. So for the Marxists in the room, Ravi has been instrumental in explaining and interrogating the relationship between disablement, exploitation, and privatization, first through his work with the great Martha Russell, and more recently in his analysis of the impact of time, temporality, and law in disability exploitation, a project which he is conducting through the framework of the activist scholar Castoriadis, and which I'm delighted to say he shared in informative form with the Marxism and Disability Network. Desperate plug inserted there. For those of us who approach this conference from a broader disability and law background, Professor Malhotra has contributed deeply to these debates, first through his work with Morgan Rowe on the social determinants of disability law through identity and narrative, and later through his work with Benjamin Isset, looking at other social determinants of disability law, namely the history of disablement and the interventions of social movements into disability struggles. For those of us who were once law students, his contribution to the Irwin Law textbook on employment and labour law will doubtless be familiar to us. And for those of us who are historians of socialism, then his groundbreaking work on the life and legacy of E.T. Kingsley will be things that we have found indispensable along our route. I'm delighted to say that Ravi will be taking us back to basics today with an analysis of the frameworks in which we use to argue for greater rights, greater autonomy, and greater freedom, namely the social model, and how a reinterrogation of materialism as a theoretical and philosophical concept can sharpen or perhaps challenge our practices hitherto. So I think that's quite enough of my yapping on. I will now invite Ravi, who has magically appeared on camera, I'm delighted to say, to begin his presentation, which will run, I believe, for around 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will have time for an in-depth Q&A afterwards. Thank you so much for your attention, and please, Ravi, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. See if I can get this. So you can see my screen now? Yes?
We can.
Okay. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that very generous, kind introduction. I'm glad that I'm able to get the camera on time. And I do apologize. I'm recovering from a bad cold, but I'm hoping that you're able to hear me as well as I can communicate. So this is a British audience. I'll say good afternoon, good morning here in Canada. Some of this may be repetitive for many of you, but I still think it's important. And it's largely based on a paper that I hope will appear subject to peer review in a new edition of a book on law and Marxism, edited by Umut Ozo and Paul Connell. So it's really in part based on that, disability, Marxism, and the law. And it's a little bit involving some of my interests with Castoriadis. So before I begin, in Canada, we typically start with a land acknowledgement. So I want to pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land where I'm speaking to you virtually. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous peoples in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So, you know, it's been a long time since I've addressed an audience of SLSA. And I remember one of my mentors, the late W. Wesley Pugh, told me back when I was preparing to go, I think it was 2004, to an SLSA meeting in Glasgow, and he told me it had been donkey years since he had attended. He had gone to Oxford, and so he had deep connections with SLSA. And now in 2025, I feel I can say in turn it's been donkey years since I've been involved, but I hope to be more active with SLSA in the future. And in fact, I had a wonderful time at the University of Glasgow, which is I think my talk was actually in an opera house, believe it or not. I mean, Canadian universities are brutalist buildings, very utilitarian, so it was quite dramatic. But without further ado, then I'm just going to go over some of these thoughts, and then hopefully we can have a discussion. So really, in this paper, I try to show this dialectical impact of the medical model, oppressive, liberatory at the same time. And I think for those of us that are writing, thinking from a class politics perspective, some could say Marxist, and many people here identify that way. I'm also influenced by Castoriadis, social democratic traditions, many other things. But I think anybody that's interested in class would see that the medical model resulted in a dramatically greater quality of life for people that are impaired, and that did away with superstition, demonology that many disability scholars have written about, and that haunted the lives of many people with impairments, and allowed for the provision of services on a day-to-day basis. And I highlight this because I think it's important for us to take stock of the upside of the medical model, because so much of it is critical. And I think this has relevance still, particularly in countries of the South, where you may be dealing with many things on an ongoing basis. So in that sense, there is still a place, and I think there's always been a place for the medical model. You know, having said that, we are disability scholars, and I'm sure I don't need in this audience to stress too much the dark side of the medical model. And so, you know, but I think it's important that you begin by acknowledging, the transition from before, and certainly in the literature. And I dabble in history. I don't claim to be a historian, but I know that there's debates in the history of feudalism. And I think it's dangerous too much to romanticize the feudal period for people with disabilities, or disabled people. I'm a huge fan of the classical British social model. And I think, as was said in the introduction, I had the privilege of working with and co-authoring this piece, which I think in 2025 remains my most cited piece with Marta Russell. And for those of you that speak other languages, recently it was translated by an activist group in Germany in German, and it's also been translated in Portuguese. And I'm hoping that it will be translated soon into Spanish and French. But I'm still working on those projects, so it remains to be seen. But I think the point here is that the medical model had its upsides, and I would push back, I think, with some of the treatments that tend to romanticize the feudal period, because while it's definitely true with the rise of Taylorism, as was said in the introduction, I'm working on a book on disability and time, and so the whole notion of time, which is utterly fascinating. And I don't claim to be an expert; I'm just a legal scholar, But I mean, the idea. So I mean, I think some people have talked about there was a lost second sleep that historians are working on. I've read that in media reports that in medieval times people would get up in the middle of the night and they would do work, or they would engage with their romantic partners in the middle of the night, and then go back for a second sleep. And I think a lot of this has been lost because with the rise of capitalism, you have a system very much where people are, monitored and regulated on for the 19th century, but it's taken on in the 21st century almost a farcical element. And as I said, I come from law. I think there's a quip that, there is no purer example of the principles of volume one of capital than the operations of a law firm vis-a-vis. It's what we call in Canada articling students or first-year associates, where you literally track what you're doing by the 10th of an hour. And certainly you see that in piecework in the IT sector. So you have these extreme monitoring. And so, I mean, that's very much the dark side of the medical model, people who have bodies that are impaired, that cannot perform in the same way as a stereotypical, neurotypical, able-bodied person. Could be physical, could be psychological, could be from a learning disability. That sort of thing means that time will impact people differently. And with Taylorism and the rise of this capitalist model, you've got a strict approach where time is money, to put it in a crass way. And I'm sure people who are more orthodox than me can put this, in the language of surplus value. So you'll see on this slide, you had the rise of institutional settings where there was a common ontological framework with expectation of labor productivity and the imposition of clock time regulation. And I think in this audience, many of you will be familiar with E.P. Thompson's famous article on this topic. And people like Martineau, many others have written recently on time. And this is what I'm working on, this book for Bloomsbury that I hope someday I will get around to writing or finishing. But it's had a qualitative research dimension. So it's taken a lot of time to do or to gather the data. And then, of course, and again, I think this is old news for people in this audience, of this rise of segregation and classification of disabled people in madhouses, asylums, charitable institutions, the canonical references of Michel Foucault. But I'm also very impressed by the work of my friend, Jeffrey Riom in Canada, who's done a lot of important work on institutions in the Canadian setting. And there's a whole cottage industry, of people. And the thing that struck me the most is that he did I don't know if ethnographic analysis would be the right sociological term, but it's about one institution. And I guess it's historical. So he goes back in time in Toronto, Canada, Canada's largest city. But one of the things he points out is that the residents actually were expected to build the wall where they were incarcerated, which is, I mean, it's a very striking thing. One of their jobs was to actually build the wall that institutionalized them. So, and it's called Remembrance of Patients Past. It was written, I think, at the end of the 90s, but I still would recommend it. I think it's an outstanding study, of the dark side of institutionalization. And then, of course, you have full-blown eugenics, and so, and again, I suspect in this audience, many of you will be deeply familiar, but I still think it bears repeating that in the popular imagination, eugenics is associated with Hitler and Nazi Germany, when in fact, Canada, the United States, many other countries had a long history of eugenics, sterilization, and surprise, surprise, it correlates with what young people call intersectionality. Many of those features are there. So you see that in the Canadian context, people that were perceived to be lesbian or sometimes just working class were difficult. In the Canadian context, Indigenous or racialized, often were targeted to be sterilized in institutional settings. So it had very much, a gender dimension, a racial dimension, and a class dimension. And certainly people like David Mitchell, Sharon Snyder, many others have written about the eugenic Atlantic and the epistemic communities that articulated, this as an entire discourse. And unfortunately, that lingered for a very long time. Some would say it never completely ended, but the fight against institutional settings, the repression of disabled people continued for a long time in those settings. And, I think was a big problem. Okay, so, and let me know if there's any problems with the slides, but I'm assuming my slides are working fine, and you'll let me know if there's a problem. But so here on this slide, you'll see some discussion of race and eugenics. And so there's a scholar named William Nelson who argued that racist eugenics took theories from biology and applied them to justify colonialism and to oppose miscegenation. So he looks at how theories of sexual reproduction compounded the robust effect of climate on animal bodies, and the organized selection of mates may allow humans to control this process. And so Nelson's theories were applied in a dysfunctional way to justify colonial oppression. And there's a clear link between colonialism and eugenics, which not everybody remembers, but I think is important to keep in mind. So you'll see that. So again, I'm a legal scholar, so I refer to the very famous decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, which Oliver Wendell Holmes said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough to justify sterilization and involuntary sterilization. And this was very much true in Canada, particularly Alberta. And, I think I've referenced a lot of this already. Sometimes I anticipate my own slides, but particularly people who were perceived as being difficult or were Indigenous or perceived as what we now call queer or racialized were targeted in these institutionalized settings. And the other big thing for those of you that are migration scholars is this whole connection with immigration restrictions. So disabled people were prevented from immigrating, and certainly in Canada, and that remains an ongoing issue for lawyers. Section 19 of the Immigration Act in Canada prohibits, people with disabilities, I got section number right, from immigrating. And you'll excuse me, because in the professional Canadian context, in the liberal world, I do say people with disabilities. For the SLSA, Disability Marxism audience, I will do my best to say disabled people, but sometimes I go back and forth. So, and I completely endorse the disabled first language, but sometimes I forget. So, in this whole business of immigration, it's very much tied up explicitly. And many would argue that the modern eugenics is still with us. And so around the world, including in Canada, United States, and EU, there's a huge backlash, and England, excuse me, there's a backlash towards migrants. And so the whole shift to productivity in terms of investment income, all these kinds of things are very, very bad for disabled people, but influence the whole notion, ontological concept of productivity as the cornerstone of worth in society. And certainly some of the Canadian litigation, I don't claim to be an immigration lawyer. This is not my area of expertise at all. But my understanding is, even people that were admitted to Canada on fast track for immigration investment purposes, they're promising to invest $1 million, $500,000, whatever it is. They're still facing problems because they have children who are labeled disabled. They have intellectual disabilities. The Canadian government perceives them as being a burden on the social welfare system. It's very icky and offensive from a social model perspective. And clearly, it's one of the reasons why, with the new eugenics and immigration hysteria around the world, a materialist reading of the social model remains important today. And I feel like here I'm preaching to the converted, but you have to remember, in Canada, the United States, the Mike Oliver, Marta Russell version of the social model, and I say that to be quick, I don't mean to exclude people like Barnes or Hunt, but I think, for short form purposes, I'm going to say Mike Oliver. In Canada, the United States, you've got massive influence by post-structuralists. And I take some ideas here and there for post-structuralism, but, it's been very much about discourse, not so much about class politics, and that's been a problem. So you'll see the ultimate, and I think this is well known, but I myself, in preparing this chapter, learned details that I had not known, and certainly there's some very interesting books on eugenics and the Nazi regime. So, there's always things we can learn. Just seeing if I can pull up. The book is by Suzanne Niddle. It's called The Historical Uncanny. It came out about a decade ago. The Historical Uncanny: Disability, Ethnicity, and the Politics of Holocaust Memory. And I confess there were a lot of things that I had not known that I learned from this book in preparing this talk and the book chapter. So it led to the extermination of disabled people, and the Action T4 program resulted in massive deaths, including disabled children at Castle Grafenek and elsewhere. But unfortunately, in the Memorial of Holocaust Remembrance, while of course extermination of the Jewish people is front and center, often we forget about the disabled people that were considered to be useless eaters, and the expansion to Roma people, GLBTQ plus people, and the whole very dark application of cost-benefit analysis, which is taken to a genocidal extreme in the Holocaust and the extermination of many groups, including disabled people. So for all of that, and here, I think this is just a repetition for many of you, but for anybody that doesn't know, UPS, the Union Physically Impaired Against Segregation, and the British social model was pioneered by many like Mike Oliver, Vic Finkelstein, Paul Hunt, Colin Barnes, Brendan Gleeson, etc. And what I remain proud to this day that my friend Astra Taylor, whose sister, some of you may know, is the famous disability artist and scholar Sonny Taylor, Sonora Taylor. She was able, Astra Taylor's now a filmmaker, very famous and extremely well connected, and she was able to convince the nation to let me do an obituary for Professor Oliver, who I did have the pleasure of meeting one time in Ottawa. So, I was very honored to be able to do that. And I think that this work, whatever the critique, and I don't think it's perfect, remains foundational, remains critical, and North Americans have a lot to learn from this. And unfortunately, not enough of it is disseminated or distributed in disability study circles in North America. It has the singular advantage of focusing on class politics, and it bears family resemblance to the historical materialist tradition. Going a little Wittgenstein on you. I'm actually doing a conference on Wittgenstein of the law in the Czech Republic in the fall, so I'm just having to bone up a little bit on my Wittgenstein. But but it's always been somewhat vague. And I alluded earlier, some of the debates around feudalism, I think there's literature on both sides, and I could claim to have an explicit answer, but I do think that there needs to be more work. And in the remainder of my time, what I hope to do is talk about some of the new directions and people that are younger than me and that are more formally trained in disciplines other than law, I think are doing exciting work, and particularly the work by Emily Ruppel, who was just hired at UC Berkeley, with a lifetime appointment. I think her work is really, really fascinating. And so if any of you have a chance to look at her work on disability and class, and I'll be speaking more about it in a minute, I think we need to look to younger scholars that are doing this sort of cutting edge work. Ariel Parra as well, doing work on social reproduction theory. I think these are in the Spanish state or in Catalonia. I think that's important. So for anybody that doesn't know, I just have reproduced on the slide the famous expression from the debate between UPS and the Disability Alliance, 1976. Disability is something imposed on top of our impairments by the way we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from full participation in society. Disabled people are therefore an oppressed group in society. It follows from this analysis that having low incomes, for example, is only one aspect of our oppression. It's a consequence of our isolation and segregation in every area of life, such as education, work, mobility, housing. Disability oppression makes it very difficult for most disabled people to maintain full employment or to relocate for employment. And the social model helped create an entire vocabulary to give voice to the lived experiences of disabled people. So just like Catherine McKinnon or my colleague Constance Backhouse had to invent language to articulate women and girls' experience in the workplace, there wasn't a thing called sexual harassment. Feminists had to invent it. Similarly, language around attendance services, for example, or simply the creation of the word attendance services and the debates around personal funding or direct funding. Different jurisdictions use different words, but I think you get what I'm saying, of personal assistance services, putting the person first, allowing the disabled person to control their life and make autonomous decisions for themselves. This requires a vocabulary. And I think the social model was foundational in letting disabled people articulate their identity, their way of seeing the world. It's a different ontology. So one of the questions, maybe we could have more of this in discussion, is what is the relevance for the social model in the era of neoliberalism? So I'm hoping the slides are advancing. And again, please jump in and tell me if there's a problem. But I hope you can see the slides. Can the social model handle the era of neoliberalism? And I say this because so much of the classical British social model was based on fighting institutional restrictions. It reflected the British welfare state and to some degree the European welfare state. So it never totally fit the American experience 100%, but arguably has to be rejigged in a world of neoliberalism where you have bureaucracy and cutbacks, and I don't want to romanticize neoliberalism, but what I would suggest is that while the literature on neoliberalism is almost overwhelmingly negative, it may also pose opportunities for liberation, and advocacy groups and theorists would be good to think about strategic ways you could use those for advantages. And one thing that comes to mind, and I know it may be a bit controversial, is, I think it's terrible how in Canada and even in England, and certainly I think in Europe, you're starting to see massive cuts to the medical system. You've seen that for decades. You see that in educational institutions. I've heard horror stories of the post-Thatcher university system. So I mean, you've got and a high degree of regulation, is my understanding, in a system where English universities don't exactly have tenure, is my understanding. So I've heard horror stories of the hour-by-hour regulation of faculty members having to report their time, which in tenured North America is not really a thing. So you have very much a dark side. But at the same time, I think it does open up opportunities, for autonomous decisions. Technology is one of them, and it may be a bit crass. One of them is simply, I think some of the medical bureaucracy has gone down. Hospital stays are shorter, partly simply because of neoliberal budget cuts, but sometimes they were overly long in the Keynesian period. And so in some ways, it may have a liberatory aspect for disabled people. And I don't mean to over emphasize that. I'm not somebody that's celebrating neoliberalism. I'm simply suggesting that there may be opportunities. It's dialectical. There's a plus side and a negative side, probably mostly negative. I do think that we should take the best traditions of developments in America and Canada in terms of what people call intersectionality, and you can still reframe that in a class perspective, taking the experiences of GLBTQ+, Indigenous peoples, racialized peoples, and others, marginalized groups. And I think that critique of the old social model was always correct, that Jenny Morris and many other people pointed out. And we need a materialist theory of impairment. That's not an original thought for me. People have been saying this for a long time. But what I want to turn to is what are the latest developments in Marxist theory and what can they offer to the social model? So I think that around, and I got to get my time zones right here. So in about 13 minutes, I'll turn to questions. Would that be acceptable to SLSA, the Marxism group? Well,
that would be about okay. If it could be slightly closer to 10, that would be ideal. But around 10, 13 minutes is fine.
Okay, I'll try to cut it short. And, one of the things that I've been working on is this idea of developing Krypton. Not my idea. Let me be abundantly clear. The developers of the concept are Alan Samuels, Alison Kafer, who developed this idea of Krypton to reflect how systemic barriers in transportation, personal assistance services, and the healthcare system lead to chronic delays for disabled people. My learned colleague, Professor McHugh Russell, suggested this phrase, which I incorporated a piece, and I think I put the piece in a chat. My RA and I, Jacqueline Moiser, we'd written a piece on Krypton that has just been published a couple of days ago in the Dalhousie Law Journal. I believe the link is in the chat, but if not, I can put it back later. And Professor McHugh Russell has this expression, which we borrowed: delays, urgencies, and arrhythmias plague the lives of disabled people. And so, and in fact, I have a funny story about it. Is we were going to share a ride because we were on the same flight going to a conference. But of course, we were unable to share that flight. Why? Because of grip time. And he was reviewing this. I need wheelchair assistance when I travel in airports. Wheelchair did not show up. So the learned professor had to go on to the hotel. We weren't able to meet. And he got a lived experience lesson in grip time. So I thought that was quite appropriate. I actually refer to this in my paper. So The one innovation that I would claim credit for is that I've argued we should distinguish between crip time from above and crip time from below. And here, that articulation, is a reference to the tradition of radical change from below. But the idea of crip time from above is the idea that you've got bureaucratic restrictions. So if you're a disabled person, you have to coordinate attendance services, paratransit bookings, medical appointments, all at the same time. And again, if you live it, you know this. I'm using physical disability examples, but the same things could be argued mutatis for people with mental health conditions that have to manage medications. Could be applied in many different contexts versus crip time from below. The whole idea of struggling to recreate an alternative vision of time where disabled people recreate time that is liberatory. And so here I'm inspired by Castoriadis and his concept of social imaginary significations. Some of you that are more orthodox may poo-poo the idea Castoriadis is not really a Marxist. Well, neither is Foucault. Strictly speaking, disability scholars learn a ton. And for those of you that aren't familiar, despite Castoriadis's anarchistic tendencies later on, Socialisme Barbarie, the group he led in the 40s and 50s, were fairly serious Marxists in, taking on the best of the radical tradition. And so, in a number of my works, I've been using Castoriadis for a while, sometimes in the context of assisted dying or death making, which I know is a big issue before the Westminster Parliament right now. And I've done that. And but I've used it in a number of contexts. And as I said, I'm working on this book based on qualitative interviews with disabled workers. But so here on this slide, I just repeat what I said, trying to balance all these things while still maintaining the different, trying to live a life, right? And certainly capitalist time requires compliance with production standards. And I don't have it in front of me, but if you read the magnum opus by Castoriadis, The Imaginary Institution of Society, and don't forget, he wrote this in the 70s, right? Castoriadis was a man ahead of his time. He writes about time in a way that very strikingly describes what people like Richard Seymour and Naomi Klein have written about as disaster capitalism, and that he sees capitalist time as a series of disasters. And he anticipates this in the 70s. So I can't stress enough how much I suggest you read Castoriadis, but that in particular, I think is interesting. And to my knowledge, very few Castoriadis scholars, with a few exceptions, have written about his theories of time. And so Castoriadis, if you're not familiar, was all about melding psychoanalysis with radical Marxism, the idea of social imaginary significations, and one of them is social imaginary time as well. So, the idea here is that you challenge conceptions of time. And you already see that in reformist campaigns, right? So you have Black History Month, you've got Gay Pride Week, you've got these challenges to contest the meaning of time. There was a lot of controversy in the United States when a day for Martin Luther King became a statutory holiday. It sounds silly now, but many conservative Republicans were opposed, or at least some of them were, and it was not necessarily popular. And you see this whole business of how do we restructure time. Those of you that are historians will know that in the aftermath of the French Revolution, you actually had an attempt to rename months, and that was an attempt to get away from the clericalism of the absolutist regime, right? So this whole idea of reframing time, this would be absolutely vital, I think, for disabled people. And so, and that the idea of crip time from below, and ultimately, and if those of you that like science fiction, I could refer you to the novels of Ursula Le Guin, where work and play in the alien society she writes about, there isn't a different word, if I'm remembering correctly. It breaks down the distinction between work and leisure time. This takes us all right back to Marx. So we'd want to think about how we evaluate the duty to accommodate in disability analysis or disability law, while recognizing that individual rights can never bring about liberation. So if you're wondering, and I don't think I'm going to get into the legal analysis that's in the PowerPoint presentation, I don't think there's time, but I think you use law strategically while still maintaining a class politics perspective. And that's what critical legal scholars have done. So some of you will have read Mute Compulsion, the new book by Mao, M-A-U, a Danish scholar. I had the pleasure of communicating him by email. And so he suggests that we look at Marxist theory of human corporeal organization. And I suggest that Mao's writings on human corporeal organization, his interpretation opens the door to developing a theory of impairment. I don't have time to do justice to this here. What I do suggest is you go out and read Mao and and think about how we consider the concept of socially necessary labor time in light of disability theory. We need to have a full-blown theory of impairment. And again, that's not Paul Aberle. Many others have already suggested this. In order to fully grapple with the implications of materialist reading of the social model. But a materialist theory of impairment should allow us to reconsider socially necessary labor time. I am by no means any sort of expert in social reproduction theory. I wouldn't be qualified to give you in-depth analysis, but Ariel Parra and others have written about it, and I suggest you look at Parra's work. She is an American scholar in Catalonia that's doing interesting work on social reproduction theory, and she argues that in an institutional setting, the objective of capitalism is to limit disabled people's ability to consume. And so it has a potential for a better understanding. And I agree with Soren Mao that we should be able to extend it beyond reproduction issues and childcare. And maybe we should think about how crip time would be used so that more disabled people can be, participating in society. So I've already said a lot. I anticipate my own slides about social imaginary time. I highly recommend you go out and read The Imaginary Institution of Society. But crip time is a way for us to consider social imaginary time in the context of Castoriadis' framework, and I would argue is a way for us to reconsider, make class politics relevant for disabled people and for the 21st century. And so this piece with Jacqueline Moiser, my former RA in the Dalhousie Law Review, we try to look at Castoriadis and crip time in the context of legal analysis. So, it's something to think about. I'm certainly not the only person who's thought this. Alexandra Shishmanos has argued for a rethinking of time, but there's relatively few of us that have explored Castoriadis' theory of time. So I think I'm doing pretty well. So I'm not going to give you the legal analysis. Those of you that are Canadian legal scholars from Canada, you'll have to go and read my scholarly work. I'll simply say that we argue that various Canadian judicial decisions should be reconsidered to challenge the dogma of productivity, to foster a thinking of crip time. Theory of crip time from below takes the best of Castoriadis, takes the best of the social model and class politics, honors the legacy of Marta Russell, who I think we all owe a great deal of debt to, honors the legacy of Mike Oliver. And with that, I will end my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ravi, for a wide-ranging and very comprehensive talk. We have around 15 minutes for question and answers, so I'm going to jump straight into it. Just a reminder for the audience, if you could please send any questions either through the Q&A, or if it's easier for you, you can direct message them to me. We will allow people spoken questions if and only if it is impossible for them to use the Q&A or chat function. So if that's you, feel free to raise your hand or come on camera and signal in some way. However, if you can possibly use the chat or Q&A, we ask you to do so. So we have a question through from one of your Canadian colleagues, Ravi, who will be starting graduate school in Canada in the fall and researching disabled immigrant/migrant healthcare workers' experience. This colleague asks what your thoughts are on the legal support, or indeed lack thereof, available for adult immigrant and migrant workers who are in Canada via work permits, such as a temporary foreign worker program, and who demonstrate symptoms of impairments, but are already wary of seeking assessment in the formal healthcare system due to their precarious migration status. Also, she asked what your opinions are if these workers are otherwise unable to access the appropriate paperwork or status to qualify for the support available to formally diagnosed Canadian citizens. Is that question clear?
Yeah, I think the question is clear. In terms of an answer, I think that you'd have to turn to the legal, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold I'm still recovering from. You'd have to turn to the clinic system. I think Canadian law schools often have clinics. There's community legal clinics. But unfortunately, whether it comes to healthcare or employment, migrants, Canada, many other places often have lesser rights. And tragically, I think clinics are underfunded. And so there's often difficulties in accessing them. But I think that would be a starting point. I know that in some parts of Canada, there's migrant worker organizations in general. They may be a starting point, and if this person is welcome to email me, I'm happy to provide information there. I think Justicia in Ontario has information, but for the purposes of this, I think I'd stop there, and I think the focus would have to be legal clinics.
Okay, that's very helpful and very concrete. I have another very concrete question for you here. One of our participants was wondering if you could recommend some literature, particularly on the distinction which you mentioned in regard to Le Guin's science fiction work, to the breakdown of a distinction between work and leisure division via a Marxist lens. So perhaps I should rephrase that. I may have read it slightly too fast. So this participant wants to know whether you can recommend some literature on breaking down the distinction between work and leisure, and particularly if you could do so, if that literature was from a Marxist perspective.
Okay, well, right off the bat, I can tell you if the question is about science fiction literature, I don't think it is. But if that's the question, no, I cannot recommend literary responses. I know Le Guin. I don't claim to be a science fiction scholar, but I suspect there's many things in that respect. But I'm assuming it's actually for literature in the social sciences. Yes, there I can. I mean, I go back to the classics. Some of them, like Castoriadis, I think would be highly relevant. I think even Margaret Russell, in a different way, would look at the whole idea of this foundational distinction. What is work about? Why are we thinking about work as sort of the be-all, end-all of this? I wonder if James Charlton's work might have some things as well. It strikes me that Charlton's work, and again, he's one of the few Americans that works in a more political economy materialist framework. I'd have to go back and look, but I suspect that you'd find good things in Charlton. But there's more people need to be working on this distinction, especially because the impact, and I don't think this is something I stressed enough in my talk, is that there's a universal aspect to these cuts. There's also people who are labeled so-called able-bodied that are also underemployed, that are also trying to get by, piecing together 3 or 4 jobs, none of which pay. I think is it England that sort of has this foundational literature on 0-hour contracts? I mean, I'm always seeing literature in the labor literature to English 0-hour contracts. I didn't actually understand what that was until somebody explained it to me. But there's an absurdity in somebody having a 0-hour contract. There's many able-bodied people that are underemployed, and so I do think that Castoriadis remains a good starting point for this sort of thing.
Thank you very much. Our next question actually ties into that point you just made about many areas of oppression being shared between disabled and non-disabled workers. One of our participants would like you to elaborate. Forgive anyone who can hear the fire engine going past the window. One of our participants wondered if you could elaborate slightly on what you mean by economic discrimination against disabled workers. Just to extrapolate a little bit from a brief question, I suppose that the participant is asking, okay, we know what employment discrimination looks like: unequal chances, unequal promotion opportunities, so on and so forth. But surely many of these things are also faced by non-disabled workers. So could you extrapolate a little bit more on the economic element of discrimination as opposed perhaps to the workplace procedural discrimination, which we're all familiar with?
Well, I mean, there's a whole range of things, just like in gender. And I don't think this is confined to Canada. You've got people, particularly people who are disabled at birth or at a young age, often are socialized into certain professions. This was also true for women. It's less true today for women, but you still have the term pink-collar ghettos. But anybody that has experience in the disability community, you will know, you'll meet, at least in North America, and I suspect this is throughout the West, you'll see women that are disabled, physically disabled, and they were not encouraged to be an engineer. They were not encouraged to be a computer scientist. They have a social work degree. It's almost a cliche. They were in social work because this is what vocational rehab counselors, they took all the girls, told them they should go become social workers, and they took the boys and told them they should become computer programmers. You don't see as many disabled people until quite recently in the high professions. You don't see them in law, medicine, engineering. And you've got significant barriers. So economic, and I don't know if this answers the person's question, but the fact that you've got job segregation, the fact implicates whether they have the same life chances. The fact that you've got equal treatment on the job doesn't acknowledge the antecedent discrimination that you've already got a segregated job market, that you've got a situation where disabled people are in this, and I've been teaching now at a law school for nearly 20 years, and you still have very few people with disabilities, disabled people attending law schools, attending medical schools. The fact, at least in Canada, newspapers write stories about them in the media, even to this day, speaks volumes to the fact that we're considered anomalies. It's not considered the norm. And so I think that's one variable that, I don't know if that's a complete answer, but that's how I'd answer the question.
Thank you very much. As you have answered the question so far very concisely, I'm in a position to abuse my position as chair, which means that if you think this is a daft question, you can say so without fear of being rude to anyone. I'm interested in CripTime from below as a resource, a revolutionary resource for disabled people. Thinking back on Castoriadis, is if I understand him correctly, I'm thinking about his early work in particular, the reimagination of time came from a shared experience of workers when work was still fairly standardized, when the same kinds of oppression, the same kinds of disasters could occur in the factory, in the office, in the restaurant, in the university, the school, right? So we have a shared experience of these disasters and a shared experience of resistance to them, which allows us to rethink time. I have two questions, really. One is, has neoliberalism actually made it more challenging to have those resources? Because now workplace and non-workplace experiences are much more heterogeneous than they once were. Sectors are much more differentiated, and our experience of time within them is much different. Secondly, I wanted your comments on some of the literature in disability studies on the experience of CripTime, which often is very subjective and often also very impairment based, right? So it's the experience of time when you have mental distress, or the experience of time when you have a chronic pain condition or when you have a sight impairment, which are not extrapolable really beyond those groups themselves. Do you see a kind of counterweight in some of the literature, a more promising way of thinking about time from below? Or do we really need to rethink, as scholars in disability, how we analyze our own experiences of time to be able to get to the kind of inputs we would need for that reimagination?
Those are fantastic questions. I mean, those are very valuable questions. Let me begin with the second point first. So I would say that even though I don't necessarily methodologically agree, the empirical experience, the lived experience communicated in the, if you want to call it, post-structuralist literary crip time literature is enormously valuable. And I still cite and recommend, because I think you have to, the pioneering work by Alison Kayford, Ellen Samuels. They developed the concept. And so, I recommend everybody read 6 Ways of Looking at Crip Time in Disability Studies Quarterly. The idea, people age faster, they may not have the same experiences. The fact that the work doesn't necessarily do the work of legal scholars and how do you rejig pension law? Well, frankly, that's not the job of a literary scholar. That's my job as a law professor, looking at how you can restructure statements and things. This brings up my reformist side, because I am a legal scholar. The things like the Danish model, for example, looking to the best that we can have while still promoting class politics. I think the empirical side is very valuable. On the first point, I have to say I would push back. I'm an optimist, right? I think that there are definitely opportunities. I was reading an article recently about, in the American context, believe it or not, about virtual picket lines and whether the labor board would recognize virtual picket lines. It may seem fanciful or not very realistic, but we don't have struggle in conditions of our own choosing. Somebody said that once. We have to deal with the situation that we have. In many, I don't necessarily disagree. I think it would be challenging, but I still think that there's opportunities for advantage. And the thing about Castoriadis is that he was ahead of his time, I think, and that he anticipated many things, and that his day has come in a way. And if trying to be as English-centered as I can, I just recall, because there's been a lot of publicity about the recent death of Alistair MacIntyre. He's a very prominent English philosopher, and in social media, people were discussing the debate that Castoriadis, I think in 1965, somewhere there, he debated Alistair MacIntyre. And the gossip that I heard, I don't know if it's accurate, but was that at the end of the debate, MacIntyre basically agreed with Castoriadis, and then that's the moment he left his orthodox Leninist past. This may be apocryphal. I don't know if this is true, but this is the story that I read, and I just thought it was fascinating. That Castoriadis debated MacIntyre, and that apparently at the end MacIntyre was largely convinced by Castoriadis's arguments, and I just thought that would be a nice way to end this. And so I thought I would tell that story.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Ravi. We are approaching the end of the day. And whether reformist or revolutionary, I'm a good union man, and I don't want to keep our tech workers or BSL interpreters working over the time we agreed with them. So it only remains to me to say thank you again to Ravi for a really wonderful keynote. Thank you to all of our presenters today, and to Nell, who has been very capably handling all of your tech queries, and to Steve, who has been recording the BSL version of this, so that will be available for BSL users after the event, if there's anything you've missed or wish to go back to. Our interpreters, of course, are wonderful. I think I speak for all of the organisers when I say that we've had a wonderful time, and we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible again at 9:30 BST tomorrow morning for another fascinating day of talks. Thank you all so much for your time. Have a wonderful evening if you're in Europe like I am, morning if you're in North America like Ravi is, and any other time of the day wherever else you are in the world. Thank you so much. Goodbye.